Assalamualaikum warahmatullah. So for today, we will continue our discussion on comparing between the Islamic worldview and the secular worldview. As I as I have mentioned earlier in the previous discussion, that to understand the philosophy and the foundation of Islamic economics, we need to go back to the concept of worldview. And we have discussed earlier that for this course, we are comparing between Islamic worldview versus the secular worldview. When we say the Islamic worldview, it is based on Islam. And I have mentioned also that all worldviews need to answer the following questions related to God, religion, man, aim in life, nature or universe, and knowledge. So when we go to the first point, that is to understand the concept of God based on the teaching of Islam, this is central concept, central philosophy in all aspects of life, including economics. The purpose of human creation is to worship Allah Ta'ala, as mentioned in Al-Quran. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. So, we are worshipping the only one God, Allah Ta'ala, and that is related to the concept of Tawheed. More important for us also to understand is how the concept of Tawheed and believing in God affects our economy. For example, we can ask a question, how, when we believe in God, that would change or that would affect our economic behavior. For example, when someone believes in God, the way how this type of belief influences his or her decision can be in many ways. One of it is to realize that all provisions given comes from Allah Ta'ala. Inna Allaha huwa razzaqu dzul quwwatil matin. That's a verse in Al-Quran. We also believe that Allah Ta'ala is Al-Ghani, He is Al-Karim. All these are names and attributes of Allah Ta'ala, showing that provisions, generosity, blessings are under His control, and He would give to whomsoever He wants. That's one part of believing in God affecting our economic tawakkul. We leave the matters about provisions to Allah Ta'ala after we put our best efforts in achieving it. This is one aspect. Another aspect, how the concept of God or Tawheed would affect our economic activities, is in the case where we would undertake transactions according to the teaching of Islam, because they are commands of Allah Ta'ala and Sunnah of the Prophets related to how we should or we must do transactions. For example, the prohibition of riba. We cannot undertake any transaction involving riba. We restrain ourselves from gambling. We cannot accept corruption, cheating, and all forms of negative or ill activities related to economic matters. And we do this not because we are afraid of law, but First and foremost is because we know that Allah is watching, and we will be accountable to Him. That's much serious matters for us to consider. And this would lead us to the concept of ihsan, where ihsan means we are doing something as if we see Allah Ta'ala, and if we cannot see Him, we know that Allah is all the time watching us. So these are some examples of how the concept of Tawheed, believing in God, would affect our economic behavior. In contrast, when we say secular worldview, in the understanding of God, we can divide this concept of secularism related to believing in God into two general perspective. The first one is the extreme position when someone totally rejects the concept or the existence of God. And we call these people as atheist or atheism, the ideology, or agnostic. This is one extreme, totally rejecting the existence of God. Less extreme than this is the position when people still believe in God but ignore the authority of God. And this latter can be discussed when we go to the concept of deen. All right. For example, someone may say that he or she is believing or is a follower of certain religion, a Christian, for example, but not a practicing Christian. This is some form of secularism. So how this would affect the behavior of people when they reject the existence of God? Let's take the extreme position. Then what's the authority? When someone rejects the existence of God, then who is holding the ultimate authority in deciding what is right and wrong? This is problematic now under this type of worldview. All right. And the concept of secularism basically started, if you read Al-Atas, sometime during the Dark Ages, when there is a movement called Enlighten. It leads to separation between uh, church and public affairs. Started from power struggle between palace and church in Europe, and then Reformation started. Slowly but surely, the king managed to separate the influence of church due to conflicts between palace and church first, and then within the church itself. For example, the movement that protests the selling of indulgence or forgiveness letters by the Catholic Church, leading to the rise of Protestantism. So these are the conflicts, and those situations put the influence of church in Europe to be weaker. And taking advantage of this, slowly the authority, the king and landlords, separate the influence of church, and slowly Europe become more secular in their approach towards life and later towards science and so on. Nietzsche, this is one famous scholar that made a very famous proclamation saying that God is dead, because this is based on his observation of what happened in Europe somewhere around the 17th century. So that's the situation now related to the position of, or the comparison between Islamic worldview and secular worldview on God. Again, I would reiterate, for us studying Islamic economics, we are interested to ask this question: if someone believes in God, how that would affect his or her economic behavior, as compared to those who say he or she is an atheist, and how then his or her behavior would be different than those who believe in God. You need to think about that question. Moving to the next point, that is view on religion. I have mentioned in our first class that Islam is the way of life. Islam is as a deen. This religion provides comprehensive ways of life, including how we should or we must conduct our economic activities. Therefore, starting from the concept of Tawheed as the core principle that guides our economic behavior, then we have many other aspects of economic activities that is based on the teaching of Islam, such as the objective of doing economic transactions. We say, Inna salati wa nusuki wa mahyaya wa mamati lillahi rabbil alamin. So, apart from believing in God, also important for us is that all of our activities, including economic activities, we do it to gain, to seek the blessing and pleasure of Allah Ta'ala. And that's part of the teaching of our religion, why we engage in economic activities. We look at certain aspect of economic activities as fardu kifayah for us to fulfill. That's also part of deen, part of religion. We do economic activities because that's part of amal saleh. Innal ladhina amanu wa amilus salihat. Muamalat, transactions, buy and sell, lending and borrowing, this can be considered as amal saleh if we do it according to the teaching of Islam. So these are some aspects that we need to consider as part of the teaching of religion. Uh, just to extend further this point, therefore, following commands of Allah and His Messenger related to economic activities is part of the way how we should conduct our economy, including prohibition of riba, the obligatory payment of zakat, to do the recommended activities such as sadaqah, waqaf, helping one another, and so on. So that's some examples related to this perspective. In contrast, from the secular perspective, starting or originating from the point of rejecting the existence of God. Now, what would guide human being in this life? As I mentioned earlier, once someone says that he or she is an atheist, then who is the authority? Therefore, here, human beings get to decide on what is the standard and values of life. What is the standard here refers to what is right and wrong in life. It's become something in the hand of human being. Before this, riba or usury was condemned in the European society because most of them are Christian, and those who say they are Christian, their revealed books prohibited the practice of riba or usury. However, when secularism encroached into the society, this no longer becomes something that they honor or they respect as some for them to follow. Therefore, now they have changed. Human being takes the position as authority, set the standards, and therefore riba is considered to be acceptable in that society now. All right, and values also become something very relative, no longer something that is permanent. What I mean here is values such as uh, this may not be related to economics, but the same society, the Western society, European society, used to condemn those who get pregnant without marriage, proper marriage. But today, when women got pregnant without proper marriage, become their norms, something that become acceptable. And slowly but surely, there is a change in values in the society there. Same-sex marriage also is another example, used to be condemned before, but now being something that is becoming norms. And to some countries, they set this values, new values in the society. That's how secularism changed the way of life. All right. Therefore, here we say that religion has no role in public affairs. Religion becomes something confined to private matters, such as funeral or wedding, and that's only for ceremonial purposes only. Therefore, only in certain ceremony or events, religion become important. That's stated here. If a society rejects God, rejects religion, claim to be a secular society, then how they decide what is right and wrong? Because as I mentioned earlier, that standard and values are now in the hand of man. There are 3 points that I would like to highlight related to how they set a new standards. Number one, it is based on scientific findings. Scientific findings. Because a secular society would believe in the physical world, something that can be proven as physical, you can find physical evidence on that, they would accept, they would believe. All right. So that's one way how they would decide standard, based on any scientific findings. Anything that cannot be proven scientifically, the default position to this form of ideology is it should not be considered as acceptable. They would ask, proof that God exists, proof that there is life after death. So they want to see the scientific evidence on that. This is the number one. Number two, the society also would accept any new standard of values based on market. And this is related to the idea of demand and supply. What is needed by the society or valued by the society is represented by how market value that. For example, if something considered to be good, but there is no value given by the market, that may not have much appreciation by the society. However, even if something is so bad, but market value that to be highly market value that to be something uh, valued much by the society, then production would take place, demand then would follow the supply. Example of this is the illicit materials online, even in cable TV, in magazine production, all this pornographic industry is wrong, it's sinful. Or religion cannot or would not reject, or religion reject this. However, because market puts such valuation, there is demand, there is supply on this, then it's become something norm, something normal in this society. This is secularism. And then the third way how a secular society would set standard of value is based on the democratic process, through voting especially. Majority decision is considered to be correct or acceptable. For example, in this case, you can see some countries in Europe, even Australia, they made a referendum to decide whether the country would accept same-sex marriage or not. Country like Australia, Ireland, Iceland, they made a referendum to know what's the perception of the population about that matter. And when majority agree on that decision, let's say to accept same-sex marriage, then that will be considered as something acceptable. And this is done through a democratic process. So that's how, in a society where religion and God and religion no longer becomes the authority, human being human being takes charge, becomes the authority, and that's mainly based on scientific evidence, market valuation, and number three, democratic process. So these are the 2 points related to number one, view on God, and we compare between Islamic perspective and secular perspective on this. And then number two, the difference between Islamic worldview and secular worldview on the concept of religion. Again, for the second point, you need to ask this question: how, when someone follows the teaching of Islam, that would affect his or her economic behavior? And then you can also ask the same set of question when someone is secular, how that would affect his or her economic behavior. All right, inshallah, I'll see you again for the next discussion that is on the concept of man. Wassalam.